April 10, 1945. The Baltic Sea stretches like cold steel beneath a gray sky. Off East Prussia, transports and cargo ships creak under the weight of civilians fleeing west. The air is sharp with salt, diesel, and smoke. Ice floats across the waves, catching pale light like shards. Each ship feels fragile, a small cradle of humanity in a merciless sea. On deck, sailors shout above engines and wind. Orders vanish into the roar. Civilians clutch their children, hands white with tension. Mothers cradle infants as if will alone could protect them. Below deck, the air is stifling. Fear hangs in the metallic taste and whispered prayers. Time stretches. Each groan of timber and shudder of machinery echoes like a heartbeat. The convoy moves like a single living beast through the fog. What should have been orderly has become urgent. Every glance toward the horizon carries dread. Every movement is a desperate effort to keep balance on icy decks. Soldiers try to calm the terrified civilians, but tension is relentless. Farther out, fog swallows shape and sound alike. A distant whistle echoes. Is it a warning or a prelude? The wind carries whispers of miscalculations, ignored storm warnings, invisible navigational errors. Sailors sense the danger. The sea is patient and merciless, watching chaos unfold. Footsteps slip on wet planks. A mother's cry cuts through the pounding waves. Soldiers grasp hands and shoulders. Children cling to anything solid. Crates shift as hulls lurch. Something feels wrong. The ominous sounds begin. The low groan of metal, water sneaking through cracks. Sudden, eerie stillness. This evacuation, one of many, is about to become a nightmare. Hundreds, maybe thousands, will vanish beneath the icy waves. Miscalculations, confusion, and the Baltic itself will decide their fate. Every heartbeat asks the same question. Will they survive the night, or will the sea claim them before dawn? By early 1945, the world of Nazi Germany was unraveling. On all fronts, the Reich was in retreat. The Eastern Front had become a desperate corridor of flight and evacuation. From the west, Allied forces pressed ever closer. From the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced with relentless force, leaving destruction in its wake. In towns across East Prussia, panic and confusion were common companions. Families gathered belongings in haste. Soldiers scrambled to maintain order. Yet for many, normal life had not entirely vanished. Small towns still lined up for rations. Shops opened when they could. Children played in the streets. But all of it existed under the long shadow of approaching catastrophe. Amid this chaos, naval evacuations became a lifeline for civilians and soldiers alike. The Baltic Sea, once a quiet corridor of commerce, transformed into a deadly theater of survival. Ships, hastily organized and ill-prepared, carried thousands away from the advancing Red Army. German naval commanders faced the impossible task of coordinating this mass exodus. They juggled limited resources, freezing winter weather, and civilian desperation, all while trying to keep vessels afloat. Sailors navigated under fog and ice, aware that one misstep could doom the entire convoy. For civilians, boarding a ship promised safety, yet it came with a terrifying gamble against nature and human error alike. The human cost of these operations was immense. Civilians packed into holds meant for far fewer people. Families huddled together, children clinging to mothers, carrying all they could salvage. Soldiers worked tirelessly to maintain order, often facing impossible choices about who could board and who could not. Each ship became a floating microcosm of wartime pressure, tension, and fragile hope. Even as the larger war unfolded, this disaster demonstrates that the horrors of conflict extended beyond the battlefield. The sea, cold and merciless, became as deadly as any artillery barrage. Early signs of catastrophe were already apparent. Smaller vessels capsized under the strain of overloading. Storm warnings arrived but were either ignored or miscommunicated. Mechanical failures, minor at first, grew more serious as crews struggled to keep engines running in freezing conditions. Missteps in coordination between commanders meant some ships departed late, others crowded beyond capacity, and vital resources were misallocated. The scene on the docks mirrored this chaos. Families pushing through throngs of people, sailors shouting instructions over the din, cargo being loaded haphazardly, panic simmering just beneath the surface. Strategically, Nazi Germany's retreat dictated these desperate measures. Eastern provinces were abandoned, while the Allies' western push limited options for safe passage. Naval convoys became not just a mode of transport, but a symbol of the Reich's failing control. Every vessel that left port carried not only lives, but the weight of strategic desperation. For the commanders, decisions had to be made quickly, often without accurate information. For sailors, survival meant constant vigilance against both the elements and the fragility of overloaded ships. For civilians, the Baltic's icy waters were a place of hope, yet also a terrifying unknown. In contrast, life continued in fractured, fleeting pockets. Markets, schools, and routines persisted in towns barely touched by immediate danger. These small reminders of normalcy stood in sharp relief against the urgency and peril of evacuation. Every moment of calm on land highlighted the precariousness of the situation at sea, and yet, the foreshadowing of disaster grew with each passing hour. A miscommunication here, an overfilled hold there, a winter storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon. These small cracks in the operation hinted at the overwhelming calamity that would soon unfold, one that history has largely left unremembered. By the time ships departed, every element for catastrophe was present. Overcrowded vessels, inexperienced crews, winter storms, and frantic civilians combined into a volatile mix. What should have been a straightforward evacuation had transformed into a tense gamble with human lives. This lesser-known naval disaster would not just claim soldiers and sailors. It would engulf thousands of innocent civilians. It would expose the vulnerability of humans against both the forces of nature and the chaos of war. And in doing so, it left a chilling testament to the true costs of retreat and desperation in the final months of World War II. The morning air was bitter, sharp enough to burn exposed skin, as families gathered at the docks. Ships sat low in the water, their hulls groaning under the weight of cargo and human lives. Soldiers moved along the gangways, checking charts and instruments, their breath visible in the icy air. Civilians shuffled in line, clutching bundles of clothing, rationed food, or children in arms. Every footstep on the wet wooden planks echoed against steel hulls, a reminder that each movement carried weight, both literal and metaphorical. Engines sputtered to life, coughing black smoke that stung lungs and coated clothing with soot. The roar grew steadily, a mechanical chorus that mingled with the cries of mothers and the shouts of officers. The first waves of fog crept across the water, thick and heavy, obscuring vision beyond the bows. Sailors adjusted ropes and cables, testing pulleys and anchors, while civilians clung to railings, eyes wide at the unfamiliar chaos. The Baltic was quiet yet menacing, each wave foreshadowing struggle. Ice drifted lazily, deceptively calm, promising danger to any hull that strayed too close. As the ships began to move, the convoy staggered forward in uneven formation. Minor malfunctions appeared almost immediately. One engine coughed and slowed, forcing a nearby ship to veer abruptly. Another hull shuddered as cargo shifted, crates of supplies toppling and sending splintered wood across the deck. Panic flickered in the faces of those aboard, but officers shouted orders, trying to impose structure on chaos. "Hold your positions! Secure the children!" One voice rang out over the roar of the waves, barely audible above engines and wind. The fog deepened. Visibility shrank to mere meters, and the sea became a gray void. The smell of diesel mixed with salt and fear, a suffocating combination that seemed to press against everyone's chest. Children whimpered, mothers whispered urgent prayers, and soldiers struggled to keep equipment operational in freezing temperatures. The decks were slick with spray, and every lurch of the ships made people stumble. Footsteps slipped, crates tumbled, ropes snapped with sudden twangs. Each small incident heightened tension, a prelude to the larger calamity lurking unseen beneath the waves. Around noon, minor collisions began. A smaller transport, pushed off course by fog and malfunctioning engines, scraped the hull of a neighboring vessel. Wood splintered, metal bent, and passengers screamed. Sailors leapt to stabilize the deck, while mothers clutched children so tightly that some lost breath in panic. From below decks came cries of confusion as cargo shifted, blocking narrow passageways and trapping terrified civilians. One officer cursed under his breath, scanning the dark horizon for signs of safe passage. Every decision now carried greater consequence, yet certainty was a luxury no one possessed. Commanders hesitated. Each ship's captain knew the stakes, but lacked information. Miscalculations multiplied. One vessel reduced speed too late, colliding with another. Another misjudged distance from drifting ice, scraping the hull dangerously close to a gaping fissure. The fog swallowed sound and vision, leaving crews to navigate by instinct and limited instruments. The sea, indifferent and immense, seemed to close in from every side. Witnesses would later recall the terror in vivid terms. "I thought we would sink at any moment," one mother whispered. "The screams were deafening. I could not hear myself think." Sailors struggled to keep engines running, hands numb, faces streaked with salt water and soot. Below deck, families clung together, huddled in darkness as the ship lurched repeatedly, threatening to tip them into icy water. The relentless waves pounded the hull, echoing through wood and steel like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature waiting to devour them. Early casualties occurred almost imperceptibly. Small craft assigned to ferry civilians from docks to larger ships capsized under weight or were crushed by larger vessels drifting too close. A child slipped from a parent's grasp, caught in a sudden surge of water on deck. Panic rippled outward, amplifying every movement into chaos. Soldiers moved quickly to restore order, but the combination of fear, exhaustion, and mechanical strain made control fleeting. By afternoon, the storm intensified. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, and freezing spray began to lash faces with bitter precision. Each wave seemed higher than the last, and the sea's rhythm grew unpredictable. The convoy, already staggered by fog and mechanical failures, struggled to maintain formation. Every creak of timber, every cough of engine, every shudder of metal foreshadowed what was yet to come. The disaster had begun in small, almost invisible increments, but the momentum toward catastrophe was unstoppable. The tension aboard the ships was electric. Every glance toward the horizon carried dread. Every misstep threatened lives. Soldiers barked orders. Mothers prayed. Sailors strained against failing machinery. The Baltic, cold and merciless, awaited its moment. Each hour that passed tightened the grip of fear. Every lurch, every groan, every shifting crate was a reminder. The disaster was no longer distant. It had arrived, quietly, inexorably, in the thick fog, the icy waves, and the panicked hearts of those aboard. Orders from higher command arrived in fragments, often contradicting one another. Some vessels were instructed to depart immediately, despite worsening weather and overloaded decks. Other ships were told to wait, creating confusion along the docks. Messages crossed paths in the fog, sometimes never reaching the intended captain. One officer later recounted the moment he realized his ship was isolated, engines sputtering, with no clear instructions from command. The uncertainty amplified every risk, turning minor errors into deadly consequences. On deck, the human struggle was immediate and raw. Soldiers grabbed ropes and life belts, hurling them to children clinging to railings. Mothers pressed infants against their chests, whispering assurances they could scarcely believe themselves. Officers made life-and-death decisions in seconds, often with incomplete information. "We cannot save everyone," one shouted, as waves swept over the deck, carrying unsecured cargo toward panicked civilians. Sailors waded through icy spray, hauling ropes to stabilize swaying crates, while below decks, families huddled together in fear, some praying, some silently accepting the impossible. Heroism was constant but quiet, measured in small, desperate acts, handholds, guiding ropes, shields against falling timber. The scale of the evacuation magnified every danger. Thousands were packed aboard vessels designed for far fewer passengers. Structural weaknesses became apparent almost immediately. Decks groaned under weight, railings buckled, hulls strained against ice-laden waves. Engineers fought failing engines, improvising repairs in the freezing cold while the convoy staggered forward. Each delay increased exposure to storm and fog. Casualty numbers began climbing almost imperceptibly at first. A small craft capsizing here, a child lost there. But the accumulation was catastrophic. By evening, the tally of the missing was already grim, though the full scope would only emerge later. Questions hovered over every movement. How could ordinary misjudgments cascade into such mass tragedy? Could overloaded decks have been better managed? Might early storm warnings have been heeded more strictly? Commanders argued over who should take responsibility, but the answers offered little comfort. Each minor oversight, a rope unsecured, a delay in engine maintenance, a misread depth chart, was magnified by the freezing sea. The Baltic was indifferent. It did not distinguish between soldier, mother, or child. Every mistake had consequences measured in human lives. The evacuation deadlines imposed by military strategy clashed violently with reality. Ships had to depart before advancing Soviet forces reached the coastline, yet weather conditions were worsening by the hour. Commanders prioritized speed over safety, forcing captains to make impossible choices. Vessels left docks with incomplete manifests, uncertain about how many souls were aboard, their hulls already straining under the load. The war demanded efficiency, but the sea demanded caution. Two imperatives that could not coexist in the chaos of April 1945. Equipment failures compounded the peril. Engines faltered in the cold, throttling power at the most critical moments. Cargo shifted with the motion of the waves, smashing crates into one another and into terrified civilians. Lifeboats were scarce and often poorly secured. Ropes snapped and boards broke under weight. Sailors scrambled to correct each failure, improvising with whatever materials they could find. In one instance, a deck officer used rope and planks to brace a tilting section of deck, buying time for families below. Each act of quick thinking delayed disaster, but could not prevent it entirely. Human resilience became the invisible backbone of survival. Sailors dove into freezing water to rescue children swept overboard. Civilians improvised flotation devices from crates and barrels. Mothers shielded their children with coats and bodies, whispering urgent instructions to remain still when waves threatened to knock them into open water. Even as panic spread, small acts of courage emerged constantly, a testament to the determination to survive despite near impossible odds. These improvisations often meant the difference between life and death, yet they could only mitigate the broader disaster, not stop it. The disaster did not unfold in isolation. Every vessel lost or damaged had repercussions for larger war strategies. Resources meant for combat, ships, fuel, crews, were diverted to evacuation. Decisions that might have saved lives were constrained by the broader necessity to move troops and civilians away from the Soviet advance. The human cost of these strategies became brutally clear. Thousands were forced onto fragile vessels to preserve territory or fulfill arbitrary timetables. Efficiency and survival existed in tension, each priority undermining the other when tested against nature's cruelty. Small cliffhangers punctuated the unfolding chaos. Ships vanished into thickening fog, their lights swallowed by the gray void. Distress signals were faintly transmitted, only partially received, reaching command far too late to coordinate effective rescues. Each moment carried suspense. Would the next ship maintain stability, or would it succumb to shifting cargo and icy waves? Would the next rope hold, or would a child be swept into the water? The sea offered no answers, only endless uncertainty and relentless pressure. By nightfall, the disaster had taken shape in full. Engines strained, decks tilted dangerously, and the fog reduced visibility to mere meters. Every human effort, every rope thrown, every hand held, every life jacket secured, was an act of defiance against overwhelming odds. Yet the cold, the chaos, and the flawed decisions from higher command ensured that no act of heroism could completely counter the forces arrayed against them. The true scale of the tragedy was only beginning to emerge, a testament to the deadly interplay of human error, desperate improvisation, and the inexorable power of the Baltic Sea. The night descended over the Baltic like a black curtain, thick fog swallowing every shape and sound beyond a few meters. The roar of engines had become a chaotic symphony, punctuated by the groaning of stressed hulls and the distant, eerie whistle of ice scraping against steel. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air. One of the larger transports, already strained under the weight of hundreds, heeled violently to port. The deck tilted, sending crates, luggage, and human bodies sliding together in a terrifying wave. Children screamed, mothers shouted their names, and sailors scrambled desperately to regain control. A second vessel, caught too close, collided with its neighbor, the impact throwing men and women into icy spray. Panic erupted instantly. The fog turned every shout into an echoing whisper, every crash into a disorienting thunder. Officers tried to issue commands, but voices were lost in the storm and the chaos. Below deck, civilians were trapped as water began to seep through gaps in the hull. Mothers pressed their children to their chests, whispering reassurances, while knowing how fragile their hold truly was. Men and women clung to whatever floated, barrels, crates, ropes, while the relentless waves threatened to pull them under. Explosions rocked the convoy. Fuel lines ruptured in some vessels, igniting fires that spread across decks slick with water and ice. The smell of burning diesel mixed with salt and smoke, choking the survivors. Sailors dove into freezing waters to save those swept overboard. Fingers slipped through icy hands. Arms grasped at anything solid. But the currents were strong, relentless. Every rescue was a gamble. Every failure a death sentence. Some survived by instinct or luck. Others perished despite bravery. Heroism and miscalculation existed side by side in a terrifying tableau. The cries were continuous, a chorus of fear that rose above the roar of engines and waves. The pounding of the sea against fragile wood became deafening. Decks tilted sharply, sending cargo smashing into people. Families were torn apart in seconds. A father separated from his son. A mother losing her child to the water before her eyes. Sailors, themselves exhausted and freezing, pushed beyond human endurance to throw ropes, stabilize tilting sections of deck, and pull drowning civilians toward fleeting safety. Yet even their efforts could not stop the overwhelming tide of catastrophe. Naval logs from the time record an almost surreal series of events. Captains noted ships capsizing within minutes, explosions leaving decks ablaze, and lifeboats either destroyed or swept away. Survivor diaries recount the horror in vivid detail. I held my brother's hand as the deck slipped beneath us. I thought we would drown together, but I felt him ripped from my grip, gone in an instant. Another recalled, I found myself alone, clinging to a barrel, listening to the screams of hundreds around me, not knowing who lived or died. Post-war interviews would later confirm that these losses were catastrophic, yet overshadowed by the broader war narrative. The human toll was staggering. Hundreds vanished in minutes, engulfed by waves or trapped beneath collapsing decks. Scores more were injured, suffering broken bones, hypothermia, or burns from fires that erupted uncontrollably. Every wave, every gust of wind, every shudder of the ship pushed men and women closer to the brink. Decisions made under duress, abandoning a child for another, leaving a lifeboat unsecured, misjudging a slip, had immediate and fatal consequences. Yet acts of courage persisted, strangers shielding one another, sailors braving icy water, families improvising flotation devices from barrels and crates. Survival was often a matter of split-second choices and random chance. As the hours dragged on, the fog remained impenetrable, reducing visibility to mere meters. Ships disappeared, leaving only faint cries carried across waves. Fires raged unchecked, consuming vessels that moments earlier had seemed seaworthy. The sea became a graveyard of wood, steel, and human bodies, a shifting landscape of terror and despair. Every survivor's heart pounded with exhaustion, fear, and the aching weight of loss. Finally, the first light of dawn revealed the aftermath. Fog still clung to the water, but broken shapes emerged. Fragments of ships, scattered debris, and bodies drifting among ice floes. Some survivors huddled on wreckage, faces pale, lips blue from cold, eyes wide with disbelief. Others clung to floating crates or lifeboats, too exhausted to move, but alive. The scale of the disaster became visible in daylight. Ships once packed with hundreds now broken, half sunk, or aflame, their human cargo either lost to the sea or suffering in its icy embrace. Among the wreckage, small acts of heroism persisted even in ruin. Sailors continued to help the weak and injured. Mothers still comforted children where possible, and civilians assisted one another in keeping afloat. Yet the scene was dominated by horror. The indiscriminate power of the Baltic, human error amplified by circumstance, and the fragile line between life and death stretched to its breaking point. This night of terror left an indelible mark on those who survived, a testimony to courage, despair, and the staggering human cost of a disaster largely forgotten by history. The disaster left an immediate and devastating imprint on both military operations and civilian life. The loss of ships, engines, and supplies delayed troop movements along the collapsing Eastern Front. Units that might have reached safety or reinforced defensive positions were immobilized, stranded by the chaos at sea. Commanders scrambled to adjust schedules, reroute remaining vessels, and consolidate resources. But the setback was irreparable. Politically, the disaster exposed flaws in German naval coordination, miscommunication, conflicting orders, and the failure to heed weather warnings became points of bitter criticism among higher echelons. For a regime already reeling from defeats, this public failure was yet another blow to authority and morale. For survivors, the consequences were deeply personal. Those who reached shore often arrived exhausted, injured, and mourning lost family members. Communities along the Baltic coast, unprepared for the sudden influx of traumatized evacuees, struggled to provide shelter, food, or medical care. Displaced families found themselves scattered across small towns, often separated from loved ones they had lost or left behind. Oral histories recount the confusion and grief. Parents searching for children, siblings searching for parents, neighbors attempting to console one another amid the wreckage. The scale of trauma extended beyond the immediate loss of life. For many, the psychological scars of that night lasted a lifetime. Post-war investigations revealed the systemic nature of the failure. Survivor testimonies, naval logs, and official records painted a picture of repeated errors compounded by environmental hazards. Inquiry commissions highlighted overloading, poor maintenance, inadequate communication, and prioritization of military expediency over civilian safety. Commanders who survived the war faced scrutiny, though accountability was often diluted in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The findings underscored that the disaster was not simply the result of weather or chance, but of human misjudgment, intertwined with structural failures in planning and execution. Modern historians have since recognized the event as one of the largest maritime tragedies of the Second World War. Yet it remains overshadowed in mainstream narratives. Unlike battles marked by clear front lines and strategic victories, this disaster occurred quietly, under fog and ice, hidden from the wider theater of wartime reporting. Its significance lies not in tactical achievement, but in the human toll and the exposed vulnerabilities of civilians caught between strategic necessity and natural forces. Today, scholars view the event as a stark illustration of the risks inherent in mass evacuations under wartime pressure, and the limits of military logistics when confronted by extreme conditions. In the immediate aftermath, evacuation plans were disrupted. Remaining vessels were reorganized, departures delayed, and additional resources diverted to rescue efforts. Troop movements slowed, and the broader German withdrawal along the Eastern Front became less coordinated. Local populations were left to contend with both the human tragedy washing ashore and the practical realities of displaced civilians. Temporary shelters were erected in schools, churches, and warehouses, but resources were insufficient to meet the overwhelming need. Many survivors endured freezing nights, illness, and continued scarcity, while grieving the lives lost in the waves. Long-term consequences were profound. Survivors carried both physical injuries and lasting psychological trauma. Entire families had been lost, altering the demographic fabric of towns and villages along the coast. Displacement led to new community dynamics, as survivors rebuilt their lives in unfamiliar surroundings, or reunited gradually with relatives wherever possible. Oral histories and memoirs became crucial in preserving memory, offering insights into both the horror and resilience witnessed that night. Acts of heroism and tragedy were intertwined, shaping how future generations understood survival amid chaos. Recognition of the disaster has grown slowly but steadily. Memorials stand along affected coastlines, commemorating those lost in the icy Baltic waters. Museums and historical societies include the tragedy in exhibitions on World War II, emphasizing civilian vulnerability and the human cost of logistical failure. Educational initiatives now incorporate survivor accounts, photographs, and artifacts to ensure that the scale of suffering and courage is remembered. While overshadowed by combat narratives, the disaster has carved a place in modern understanding as a reminder of the fragility of life, the consequences of misjudgment, and the resilience of those who endured one of the war's most overlooked maritime catastrophes. The naval disaster of April 1945 stands as a haunting testament to the interplay of chaos, human error, environmental hazards, and courage. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives were swept away in icy waters, victims of overfilled ships, miscommunication, and a relentless sea. Yet amid the horror, acts of heroism, sailors diving into freezing waves, mothers shielding their children, officers making impossible choices, illuminate the resilience of the human spirit. This tragedy reminds us that history is shaped not only by battles won or lost, but by the ordinary lives caught in extraordinary circumstances, the lives that often vanish from official accounts. The lessons are profound and enduring. Large-scale evacuations, especially under the pressure of war, demand meticulous planning, clear communication, and unwavering attention to safety. Neglecting any of these elements can transform efforts to save lives into catastrophes. The events on the Baltic Sea underscore the fragility of human endeavors when strategy clashes with nature, and the consequences of misjudgment ripple far beyond a single moment. For those who survived, these lessons were learned in the most brutal of classrooms, their memories a constant reminder of both vulnerability and courage. Symbolically, the disaster embodies the duality of humanity under extreme conditions. Fear and despair coexisted with bravery and selflessness. Children clung to strangers, strangers shielded each other, and small gestures of care often determined survival. These stories, reconstructed from survivor testimonies, naval logs, and post-war accounts, illustrate how ordinary people can confront extraordinary danger with both ingenuity and compassion. The legacy is clear. Even in overwhelming circumstances, humanity's resilience persists. Today, memorials along the Baltic coast, museum exhibits, and educational programs preserve this history. Historians continue to uncover the stories of survivors, giving voice to those silenced by tragedy. By studying these events, we honor not only the lives lost, but also the courage of those who endured. This disaster, once hidden in the fog of history, now serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of war beyond the battlefield. If this story moved you, take a moment to learn more about the lesser-known tragedies of World War II and the personal stories behind them. Share this documentary to keep the memory of those lost alive. Support historical education and reflect on lessons that remain relevant today. History is not merely to be read, it is to be remembered, shared, and acted upon. As the cold Baltic waves slowly cover the remnants of the past, let us honor the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of those who lived and died. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest hours, humanity can shine through if we take the time to remember.